Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Self-Sovereign podcast. We discuss a range of topics related to autonomy and self-empowerment. My name is Justin Smith. I'm an independent documentary filmmaker. Our guest today is Dr. Srini Pillay. Today's episode is about using the power of the unfocused mind and reinventing ourselves based on our personal values. Dr. Srini Pillay is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and brain researcher. After graduating at the top of his class from medical school in South Africa, he received a Medical Research Council scholarship to study the neurochemistry of panic. Srini has also completed fellowships in Psychopharmacology, structural brain imaging, and functional brain imaging. Aside from his academic career, Srini prepares and delivers top-rated leadership development courses for some of the largest Fortune 100 companies. He speaks and teaches throughout the US, Canada, London, Paris, Switzerland, India, Greece, and Brazil. Being an internationally recognized expert in applied brain science and human behavior, Srini is the author of several books. His latest book is Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, Unlock the Power of the Unfocused Mind. The book explains how we can harness our mind's innate tendency to wander, stall, rest, and unfocus to become more productive. Dr. Srini Pillay also features in my documentary series, Mismatched, Your Brain Under Stress, which has been produced in collaboration with the American Institute of Stress. Dr. Srini Pillay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dustin. Always lovely to talk to you.
Okay, great. So to start with, can I ask you, when did you first become interested in the brain?
I actually don't know what the technical answer to that is, but I think I've always been interested in why we do what we do and what underlies that, I think, from the time I was a child. I think in medical school, my interest in the brain peaked probably because I recognized what a crucial role it played in overall biology. And suddenly, as a psychiatrist and a brain researcher, being able to delve into that just deepened my interest. And now as Chief Medical Officer of Rule, where we're looking at brain-based interventions using video and virtual reality to decrease stress and anxiety so that we can potentially reverse the negative gene changes that lead to cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease. I'm really interested in the brain as a potential target to prevent chronic disease.
Okay. I know that one of your areas of interest is the mind-body connection. Have you seen a shift over the years in terms of how acceptable that's become as a field of study?
Yes. I think it's always been on the minds of academics, for example, that the mind and the body are connected. I think academics debate about whether the mind is the brain or the brain is the mind. And I still think that debate is ongoing. But I think there's an increasing understanding of the fact that the entire body is connected. And that, for example, gut-brain interactions have been researched a lot. The fact that in psychosomatic medicine, the impact of the mind on the body has been researched a lot. So I think that interest has been increasing.
And are the terms unfocused mind, the unconscious, and the subconscious all interchangeable?
Not necessarily. I think in terms of unconscious and subconscious, unconscious is just a more formal academic word that's used for what people call the subconscious. When I talk about the unfocused mind, I'm talking about specifically the default mode network, and that does operate largely outside of conscious awareness. But in the same way that the gut and the brain are connected, the unconscious and the conscious mind are connected. And so they don't necessarily operate independently of each other. And for that reason, I would say that these terms loosely describe and point to what we're talking about, but they don't necessarily highlight the fact that there are huge interconnections between the conscious and unconscious mind.
And could you give a few examples of when scientific breakthroughs or other breakthroughs have occurred during unfocused activity, or, if you like, unfocused mind states?
Yeah, well, Albert Einstein famously said that his discovery was a musical perception. And really what he meant by that was that he used lots of logic, and he subsequently was able to deduce things logically. But the way in which he stumbled upon this was actually through some kind of nonlinear, what he called musical perception. And I think that was a pretty profound discovery. Also, synthetic DNA was discovered in a way that was completely unconscious. The founder was driving from Berkeley to Mendocino, was in the car with his girlfriend. They stopped by, he scribbled something on a rock, then was still headed to their cabin, and all of a sudden, suddenly realized what had happened. And his lab mates did not like him because he wasn't following a strict, what they call, scientific operational plan. But in fact, his discovery came by some kind of nonlinear path. And suddenly people like Elon Musk have talked about the fact that they have some of their best ideas in the shower. So I think that there's lots of evidence to show that people don't always arrive at profound conclusions logically. A lot of the time, it involves this kind of unfocused mind. Steve Jobs famously pointed out, and what he said was, you can't join the dots moving forward. You can only join them looking backwards. So to actually understand anything, you have to believe in something like that he called gut, karma, life, destiny, whatever. And what I call that is the default mode network, which is the unfocused network in the brain that is constantly talking to the focused network, but which is different because it is able to retrieve information that the focused brain cannot retrieve. It is able to engage in complex thinking and abstract thinking. And it is also able, it is called the crystal ball of the human brain because it is able to predict more accurately than the logical brain could.
Would you say that it's fair to say that significant breakthroughs rarely happen during focused activity and are much more likely to happen during unfocused times?
Yes, I would say that that's true with one caveat, which is that sometimes focus can lead you into a flow state. And in that flow state, you feel a combination of the direction and the guidance of the focused mind while the unfocused mind is wandering. And so I often think that they're actually working together, but that the state of flow where you're locked into an idea can be precipitated by a logical thought process.
I guess one of the most obvious examples that anyone can relate to would be when we're having a conversation with someone and we can't remember someone's name who we know very well, or the name of a place. And then the moment that the conversation switches to another subject, suddenly it comes to the front of our mind somehow, that person's name or the name of the place that we couldn't think of just now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it's interesting that we know these things, but we don't really give ourselves time to unfocus. Somehow we believe that the only route to productivity is through the logical brain, when in fact, it's not the only route. Sometimes it's the slow route to getting things done.
Great. Could you explain what neuroplasticity is?
So neuroplasticity is the capacity for the brain to change. And a long time ago, we believed that the brain was fixed and that, what you have is fixed for the rest of your life. But what we've understood since then is that brain pathways can be reconfigured and the brain can change as a result of different interventions. So neuroplasticity is simply the capacity of the brain to change.
And does neuroplasticity apply to all parts of the brain, or is it specific to certain parts?
The term itself refers to all parts of the brain. And in terms of whether parts can change, up until now, I don't know that there's been any evidence showing that any part of the brain cannot change.
Okay. And so I guess that it's neuroplasticity that explains how people can reinvent themselves in so many different ways.
Very much so. The self circuitry in the brain, the circuit that's involved for self-awareness, and who one is actually this unfocused circuit, this default mode network. And so if you can get into that network and create some kind of entropy that allows the self to come apart, something that I call positive disintegration, which is a term that was originally used by Dabrowski, who was a Polish psychiatrist and psychologist. What he said was that you can come apart to come back together again in a new way. So absolutely the self can be reconstituted.
And just thinking about trying to reinvent ourselves, what would be some of the potential major obstacles to that? One thing I read about previously was if there are some kind of self-destructive programs running on autopilot in our brains. If that's the case, and what can we do about that?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of obstructions to self-reinvention. I think one of them is cognitive dissonance that occurs due to change. So the brain, although the brain can change, it responds as if there's chaos. There's some kind of alarm the moment there's some kind of change. And what that does is it activates a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. And the anterior cingulate is the conflict detector. So the moment you're trying to change, your brain says, hey, wait. And one of the things we know is that the way you can deal with this is by stimulating the left frontal cortex, which will then allow you to be committed to change. So we ask, well, how do you stimulate the left frontal cortex? There are a few different ways, but one way is what is called spreading of alternatives. And what that means is that you have alternative A, which is the version of yourself today, and you have alternative B, which is a different version. So let's say you are a corporate worker and you have a high-level managerial position, and you want to become person B, which is an entrepreneur. Your brain immediately says, no, but you won't have any security, you don't know what to do. It says, but what we know is that once your brain grasps what will be better about this other state, these two states are like this. Once it says, even you'll have more freedom, you'll have more flexibility, you'll be able to make your own money, you won't have to answer to people, you can dress the way you want. You are spreading those alternatives because you're showing why this other alternative is so much greater. Once your brain buys in, it actually can activate the left frontal cortex, which then allows you to be committed to change. But there are other things that I think make people anxious. There's a psychodynamic formulation of anxiety that I particularly like, which is that anxiety is the cry of the self that is calling out in the process of becoming. And that's because the self is we have these habit circuits in our brain, and when we're stressed, stress activates those habit circuits. So when you're trying to change amongst that, you have to break through the resistance of stress in order to change. And even if you break through the resistance of stress, you then have anxiety because you feel like you're reconstituting. What Dabrowski describes in his positive disintegration model is that most human beings, if you look at the pyramid, most human beings are living at the bottom because they're just fulfilling their basic needs, for food and sex and sort of family. But then you begin to realize, wait a minute, something's not quite right, but you're still not in touch with it. Then you get to the next level, which is where there's positive disintegration. And what that means is you realize, I've not been living a life that's true. And that's when you realize you've got to make a lot of changes to get to stages 4 and 5, where you live a more values-driven life. So another way to facilitate effective change is to recognize that any anxiety that you feel about that change may be the cry of the self in the process of becoming. And when you do this, you can use your values to guide you. For example, if you value freedom, then choose a job that will allow you greater freedom. If you value hedonism, choose a job that will give you a lot of pleasure. If you value money, choose a job that will give you a lot of money. And suddenly when you realize that, you realize, wait a minute, it's not that hard to reconstitute my full job, that my full new version of myself. I can actually construct this by simply reflecting on my values. I think a third formulation that I would offer related to the difficulty to change relates to a quote by Kierkegaard, which was that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That we all say we want to be free, but the moment we even think about it, we feel like there's no gravity. And so we choose balls and chains in our lives. We call them responsibilities or duties. But actually, one possibility is that they are there to prevent us from entering a state of greater freedom, because freedom is intimidating. And so in that sense, I think it's important to try to understand why it is that we're intimidated by freedom and what we can do about that. I think a fourth construct that comes to mind is called contrast avoidance theory. And contrast avoidance theory has to do with why people worry. People will say, oh, I don't want to change. I'm just so worried. I'm worried about my life. I'm worried about making money. Well, contrast avoidance theory teaches us that one of the main reasons that people worry is that there are peak states in life, and then there are these low states in life. So worried people keep themselves in the miserable middle, because if they change, if they go from peak to trough to peak to trough, the contrast is very frightening. But if they stay in the miserable middle, then the contrast is less. So I think that overcoming cognitive dissonance by using spreading of alternatives, understanding that anxiety is a cry of the self, and using values to guide you, and also understanding your intimidation by freedom and understanding this fear of contrast are some of the ways in which you can begin to explore yourself so that you can allow for a self-reinvention.
And in terms of understanding, if you like, what kind of direction we should follow in order to know how to reinvent ourselves, is it the case that we need to, in a way, schedule enough unfocused time so that, if you like, those values can come to the surface and we can be more aware of our true values and which direction we should go into in order to reinvent ourselves?
Yes, I think what the unfocused time does is it introduces you to a different kind of confidence, which I've been thinking about with Jim Selman, who's a sort of thinking partner on the subject, which we call existential confidence. And existential confidence is a commitment to a possibility that is not yet a reality, but which you believe you can deliver on, even if you've not delivered on this in the past. And what this tells us is that the future is unpredictable. In terms of what direction to choose, who knows? It's impossible to know. But what you can do is use this future possibility as some kind of vision of the future, and then bring it to the here and now and let your own vision direct you. And I think when you have this time that you set aside, then your ability to connect with what this vision might be increases, and the clarity of that vision increases, and so your brain's GPS can actually understand where you want to go. Too often people are looking outside for direction. What's the best market? Where's the best pay? And then all of a sudden you get sideswiped. It's like the whole sort of NFT thing that happened, where people were like, oh, this is where the money is, and suddenly you get sideswiped. But if you use your own resourcefulness, you're much more likely to find a toughness of mind that will allow you to navigate into the future.
And of course, when we say unfocused activity, that of course could be anything in accordance with the preferences or the hobbies of the individual person, from taking a walk in the park, reading a novel, or any other hobby that they might have.
Yes, I mean, there are some ways to strategically unfocus. So 5 to 15 minutes of napping can give you 1 to 3 hours of clarity, which is interesting because a lot of people will sometimes just try to make it, plow through the day to make it to the other side, rather than regularly unfocusing. Doodling can improve memory by 29%, so simply doodling can be helpful. Positive constructive daydreaming is something that was studied by Jerome Singer, and Jerome Singer found that if you sit at your desk and daydream, it's not helpful. If you daydream while you're thinking about what happened the day before, it's not helpful. But what is helpful is if you set aside 20 minutes of your time and you do something low-key, like walking, knitting, or gardening, and then you let your mind just wander into something positive and wishful, like lying on the beach or lying on a yacht or running through the woods with your dog. This actually really helps your brain to feel more creative and to feel more energized. And then there's booster breaks. Taking a 15-minute break can decrease your stress and anxiety significantly if you're involved in some kind of physical activity. So those are some of the ways in which that have been studied that can actually boost your energy and increase your creativity as well.
Great, thank you. Could you also talk about the importance of choosing carefully the people you spend time with and the people you hang out with in general to facilitate your reinvention?
Yeah, so who you're surrounded by is super important because right now, even though you're somewhere else and I'm somewhere else, you actually live as an image in my brain, and I live as an image in your brain. And when you're hearing me, I also live in your auditory cortex. So what this means is the people who surround you are actually living in your brain. When I work with CEOs and they're asking me, should I hire this person or not? I'll say, well, do you want them to live in your brain? Because if you want them to live in your brain, that's fine. And that really makes the point. But beyond that, there are also mirror neurons that we have. And these mirror neurons are neurons that can mirror other people's actions, emotions, or intentions. So if you surround yourself with people who are dour and sad and always down, it can make it really difficult because this then mirrors in your brain, and you are then blocked from experiencing any kind of positive emotion because the people you're surrounding yourself with are impacting that. I think that the next thing I would say is that for motivation, social interactions with people you trust really matters. And so that's super important when you're surrounding yourself with other people.
And we seem to be at a time where there's increasingly rapid change and increasing amounts of uncertainty. Are there any tools or mindsets that people can use to help with this kind of environment?
Yes. So when you are uncertain, 75% of people mispredict when bad things are going to happen. And that's because the brain goes into a catastrophe state. So the first thing you want to do is actually use self-talk to help yourself become less anxious and help yourself understand that it's not that something terrible is going to happen. It's that your brain is making up this catastrophic story. I also use a 5-step process called CIRCA, which stands for chunking, ignore mental chatter, reality check, control check, and attention shift. And what this means is when you're feeling overwhelmed and anxious, chunking is break things down, ignore mental chatter is sit back in your chair, close your eyes, and focus on your breath. And when you focus on your breath, this actually helps you, it decreases amygdala activation and helps you calm down. The R, which is reality check, is self-talk, which is this too shall pass. Then the C, which is control check, is like the serenity prayer. What can I control? What can I not control? And what's the difference? And the A is attention shift, which is how do I shift my attention from the problem to the solution. There's also a CIRCA app, which is a free download that can be super helpful for people who are looking to decrease their overwhelm. Rule, the company that I co-founded, is all about mindset resets. And so in corporations, we're actually helping people use video and virtual reality in real time to actually decrease stress and anxiety. We've studied this at Mayo Clinic, and we're able to find that we could decrease anxiety and emotional distress and improve focus as well. So video and virtual reality is super important in that respect.
Okay, and a slightly different topic. There's increasing interest in psychedelics, and quite a few very popular podcasters and kind of self-help gurus have been popularizing the use of psychedelics, and even a number of very prestigious universities have started to do proper bona fide scientific research into their use. I think particularly with terminally ill cancer patients. So what's your view on this huge and expanding field?
Well, I think in science, it's being approached reasonably in the sense that we're trying to study whether psychedelics have the impact that we think they have. Robin Carhart-Harris has written extensively on this. And what I was talking about earlier, this entropy in the self-circuitry can be created by psychedelics. But the reason that all of these studies have psychological support as well is they realize you still need to be guided through the process, that without that guidance, it can be dangerous to simply use psychedelics. So overarchingly, there was also a study published last year in November in the New England Medical Journal by looking at psychedelics for treatment-resistant depression. And 30% of the people responded to the 25 milligram dose rather than the 1 milligram dose. which was very promising because treatment-resistant depression is resistant to treatment. So the fact that psychedelics can be an alternative treatment, I think is helpful. I also think it's helpful that that people think that it could be useful for post-traumatic stress disorder. There's some preliminary evidence that psychedelics may be able to decrease inflammation. But like all things, I think we need to study this, and we need to personalize it, and we need to understand who will benefit from this when. And also, I think it will help to have people trained in order to deliver this. Now, that said, I have friends who do use psychedelics recreationally, and they present a counter-argument. Their counter-argument is that medicalizing psychedelic use is a business strategy that is not part of what psychedelics are really supposed to be. That psychedelics are supposed to be taken, with the help of a shaman in a natural environment, with a group of people in a social environment, and that sitting in a doctor's office is going to change the context in which the psychedelics are delivered. I think that's an interesting hypothesis to explore. I do hope that someone will do a study where they compare psychedelics administered in a doctor's office with psychedelics administered in the woods or in the wild, to see whether there's a different outcome in those two instances. But overarchingly, I think that the reckless use of any drugs is problematic. But I think that when drugs are used in context, in a way that can be helpful, with bearing in mind what the potential side effects and long-term effects are, that this could be a useful balm while you're trying to get through life. I do think that one of the things we are stepping away from as a society is agency. So the thing about meditation that's different is that you are choosing to be in a certain mental state. The mental state is not being induced by something outside of you. So even if you're doing psychedelics, I would recommend that people not lose sight of agency, and that people recognize that agency is a very powerful medicine. Certainly, autonomy can improve motivation according to self-determination theory, and connecting deeply with yourself is a really useful way to navigate through life. So overarchingly, I think that psychedelics are offering a lot of promise, and that we're yet to see phase 3 evidence for when they could be helpful.
And I guess we're not really at the stage where we can make a proper assessment or comparison against other ways of achieving non-ordinary states of mind, like, for example, hypnosis. I mean, we're not really there where someone could say, like, hypnosis is better for these circumstances and psychedelics might be better for these other circumstances.
No, and that's partly because I really don't believe in the fundamental approach in medicine right now. So if you look at all medical studies, they generally look at group effects, right? So they say, let's look at hypnosis in this group of people, then let's look at psychedelics, and let's see which one is better. Well, when somebody walks into so let's say hypnosis works for 40% of people. Then when you walk into my office, how do I know who you are? Are you part of the 40% or part of the 60%? I have no idea. It's the same thing with the rest of medicine. For example, well, I'll answer this question first, and then I'll make a sort of commentary statement. So I think that group effects are a rough approximation of the possibility of efficacy. I think we need to move more urgently in the direction of personalization and idiographic medicine. And what this means is, personalization means, we have this information at our fingertips, like demographics, history, we can get biometrics, physiologic markers, genetics, epigenetics. Why don't we take all this information that you have and try to see how this can help us determine whether a particular intervention is good for you or not? And that idiographic medicine recognizes that actually the body changes all the time. So you are not the same person in the afternoon as you were in the morning as you were yesterday. So can we even hyper-personalize what that is? And I think the more we move in that direction, the better. But people in general, I feel, for pretty much any fact in medicine that you offer me, I can probably offer you studies with a counterfact. The counterfact has just not been marketed. So, for example, if you look at LDL cholesterol, which is supposed to be bad cholesterol, 19 studies were examined in the British Medical Journal in a meta-analysis, and they found that in about 16 of them, a high LDL either had no impact on your mortality or it was good. that it prevented the mortality, which is a message that has not been shared with the community. Now, there's also been studies that show that high LDL is very bad for you. So if we just say, so if I had a high LDL, I wouldn't know what to do because I would have to intuit whether I wanted to change something in my diet because I would know that it could either be good or bad for me to lower that. So similarly, I think when it comes to hypnosis, psychedelics, we need to become more refined rather than just relying on double-blind, placebo-controlled group studies. These studies are relatively useless to clinicians if you really think about it deeply. And I feel very passionately about this because I feel that medicine is not set up to collect data. On the one hand, our privacy processes protect people's personal information. On the other hand, they are huge obstructions to machine learning and trying to really personalize these interventions. So I think we need to strike a middle ground where information is protected, but it's not restricted for the purposes of research.
I totally agree with you, especially regarding LDL cholesterol. There was a study, I think it was in the American Heart Journal, and it was a huge study, and they actually found that the average LDL level for people with diagnosed heart disease was lower than the general population. Obviously, that's the opposite of what we're expected to believe. And I think cardiovascular medicine in particular has really gone too far down this kind of simple risk factor approach, where they'll take just a short list of biomarkers and then magically come up with a percentage for that individual person's risk. They'll say, like, you have a 9% chance of having a heart attack in the next 5 years, which just seems ludicrous. If we just think about all of the factors that could contribute to someone having a heart attack or not, the idea that you can just take a short list of numbers and then magically give an accurate estimation.
Yeah, and it's also driven, I think it's driven partly politically, and it's driven by experimenter bias. Experimenter bias is one of the biases that I think really needs to be examined. For example, I don't know how many meat eaters are doing studies showing that vegetables are good for you. How many people who, would I do a study showing that steak is bad for you? I wouldn't, because I like it. So I think we need to have people from different fields declare their differences and be involved in the research so that the research is more believable. But another example of this is antioxidants, right? Antioxidants are, everyone's, eat your vegetables. The green vegetables are filled with antioxidants. They're really great. Well, what is this? Are antioxidants good for you or are they bad for you? Well, we have no idea. And we have no idea because in general, there are many studies showing that they're good for you, but there are also studies that show that they may accelerate malignant progression. So what do? Just overdose on antioxidants and hope that you don't accelerate a cancer? Or do you just take it because you know that they're good because they protect your cells? Well, who knows? But again, I think integrating that information allows you to make more mindful decisions about what you're eating rather than just following the marketed messages, which may or may not be true.
Do you think that this might initially sound a little bit strange to some people, but do you think that there is something that's been lost in the medical profession in terms of the art of being a doctor? And potentially we could have too much focus on the scientific aspect. And that might sound strange to a lot of people because we've almost created science as the new religion. And it's kind of, in line with that, it's kind of blasphemy to even suggest that something should be less scientific as such. But the reason why I think that is because, of course, we can never be in possession of all the scientific facts. And I see the role of a doctor as being a combination of the scientific data that we have to date, but also drawing upon their intuition and their vast experience, and also hopefully knowledge of that individual patient as well.
Yes, and so I do believe that medicine is both an art and a science, and part of it, and this rests on a number of different things. So historically, people often use the doctor as a point of social contact, someone who cares out in the community. And you might think, well, what does caring have to do with anything? Well, caring has a lot to do with things. Loneliness can actually increase coronary calcification. It can lower your immunity. So if you are someone if you are someone in the community who feels alone, but you have your doctor as a point of contact, that can be protective to your physiology, and it's achieved through the art of interpersonal interaction. But if you look at what's going on right now, and I'm most aware of what's going on in the US and the UK, if you try to get, a friend of mine called me the other day and tried to get an appointment with the neurologist for his mother, he has to wait 6 months. And he probably will see the neurologist for 10 minutes. When I speak to my friends in the UK, the system is completely overburdened. It's impossible to see anybody for more than 5 or 10 minutes. What kind of relationship can you actually have with someone? So, and doctors are also burnt out. They're significantly burnt out. And so, people will say things like, well, doctors should be paid less, so they shouldn't be. Well, certainly you can pay doctors less, but you will attract a very different kind of person into that position than a hyper-competitive, sort of hyper-ambitious person who is deep thinking. That doesn't mean that if you don't care about money, you don't think deeply, but you will attract a different kind of person. And so I think these are all controversial things. I certainly don't know the answer. I think that the systems are financially overwhelmed. I think that the money is inequitably distributed. Certainly I'm biased about this because I'm a psychiatrist and a brain scientist, but if you look at the figures, they don't really make sense. Depression and anxiety cost the world approximately $1 trillion in lost productivity. And psychiatric illnesses cost the world $2 to $5 trillion, expected to go up to $6 trillion by 2030. Psychiatric illnesses are not independent of medical illnesses. They are associated with heart disease, with all kinds of medical diseases, with epigenetic changes, and then with chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease. So why is so little money being funneled there when the World Health Organization asked 169 countries to examine what percent of their budgets, of their healthcare budgets, were going toward psychiatric disorders? It was 2%. So on the one hand, we're talking about, it's important for doctors to be able to manage the whole person and think about the whole person. On the other hand, there's no impetus to think about the whole person because doctors are not going to be compensated for this. Hospital systems will not be compensated for it. So we're stuck, I think, in this complexity where you have the doctor, the patient, you have systems in control, and then you have the government. And so unless there's some kind of cross-sector communication where everybody recognizes the priority of every sector, I think this becomes a systemic issue that's very difficult to address.
A couple of years ago, a close friend of mine told me that his nephew had just got a position to study medicine at Cambridge. And he was delighted, of course, and of course everyone else in their family was also delighted. But I couldn't prevent myself from being disappointed in a way because I've done a number of documentaries, of course, on medical related issues. And when I think of doctors, I just see them as being really getting the pressure from all sides. In the UK we have something like 5 or 6 minutes per consultation. Of course, the patient is walking through the door and they're expecting to go away with something, a prescription, of course, or something to cure them, or at least make them feel better. And on the other side, of course, you've got all the medical organizations giving all kinds of rigid, increasingly more strict and rigid guidelines that they have to follow. I don't know. I think it's really unsustainable profession at the moment.
I think so too, and I think that the medical industry is falling apart. McKinsey has written a piece on this, showing that it's really not sustainable financially. And I really believe, I believe this for myself, and as a doctor, I've always said I've treated my patients the way I would treat anyone in my family. The number one advice I would give to anyone today is start investing in self-care. Start investing in what you think will prevent what's going on. Collect information, ask questions, but self-care is where it's at. I think if you're expecting the medical system, I think for emergencies, I think for certain forms of treatment like chemotherapy, there's certainly a lot of use for medical institutions. I'm not bashing the institutions. I just think the system as a whole feels very unsustainable to me. I know at a personal level, I left the program I was directing in the hospital that I was at because, I tried to push it as much as possible. I would see people for at least 20 minutes and preferably for 45 minutes. And I was there when the transition occurred to 10 minutes to 20 minutes. And eventually, the overall directors called me and they said, what are you doing? Why are you still seeing people for that long? And I said, because I cannot provide proper care in that setting. And they said, well, it's a rule. You're going to have to not do that. And so I thought about it and I thought, I think I'll just transition to a private practice. And you go to a private practice and you start seeing people you can see, but you can't work with insurance companies because they'll restrict how you're working, which means you end up serving privileged clientele, and the people who are going to the hospitals are not actually doing that. So I agree. I think it's very challenging to do that. I feel very fortunate to be able to work with hospital systems who are researching these institutions. Roulet is working with Mayo Clinic, and they're very sort of advanced thinkers who are thinking about the whole person. We're working with integrated medicine. So to be able to be an entrepreneur, it's challenging because people are scared to invest in anything that's innovative or potentially life-changing. They sort of want to invest in systems or the same old thing. But I try to use existential confidence myself, and I'm sort of the only way I can be in this field is to change what I can to offer something better to people than they currently have.
And just thinking about that, encouraging people to take responsibility for their own health as much as possible. Do you have any views about so-called complementary, different forms of complementary medicine, such as nutritional medicine or body work or any kind of energy medicine? Do you have any kind of favorites that you think do have, more of a scientific basis?
Yeah, so I think I don't have a favorite, but I think they're all worth trying if they are research proven. So nutritional interventions, certainly the mind body the gut brain interactions have been widely recognized, and so different foods that you can eat that you can at least try to change. If you're sensitive to gluten, you could try eliminating that from your diet. There's evidence for the keto diet that's not really that intense, but it's there. It's increasing. But there's also evidence for the Mediterranean diet that shows that people will be less depressed and anxious. So nutrition to me is a very important nutrition is a very important aspect of overall health. Physical exercise, I think, is super important. At least moving. When you look at the Blue Zones Project, moving naturally is really important. I also really like meditation. Transcendental meditation was shown in a smaller sample size, but in long-term meditators, to downregulate all 49 genes associated with inflammation and to upregulate the genes associated with immunity and oxygen carrying capacity. Mindfulness meditation and transcendental meditation have been shown to protect genes, so that at the ends of genes there are telomeres, and as they get shorter, you get more illnesses and then you die. But these forms of meditation can protect those telomeres. And they've also been shown to have positive effects on blood pressure. So I think that what we're calling alternative practices need to be brought mainstream. My interest in the metaverse and in virtual reality is not only that it will allow greater access to care, and self-care can be directed within the metaverse, but also that so far the East has really been carrying this whole construct of meditation, and there's been a lot of positive things about it. But only 10% of the world meditates. So how do you alter your consciousness states? Certainly you can use drugs like psychedelics and then think about how you want to use them responsibly. But virtual reality offers you an experience that can mimic many of the things that happen in meditation. In virtual reality, you can levitate, you can float, you can go beyond time, you can feel all these different consciousness states. What I'm really interested in is how do we connect changes in consciousness states in the metaverse with inflammatory markers, with proteomic markers, with epigenomic markers, with genomic markers, so we can begin to inform ourselves that there is a connection between how you change consciousness state and your biology, and how that then impacts your morbidity and mortality. So overarchingly, I think that nutrition, hypnosis, meditation, and virtual reality are all very helpful forms of intervention that should be tried responsibly.
But would you also say that with virtual reality, we have to be, mindful, which seems like a strange word for virtual reality, but it's because we don't go too far into the, if you like, the artificial world and just kind of enjoy everything that will be, I guess, much more easily obtained in that artificial world.
Well, I think, virtual reality is so interesting because when you're in virtual reality, you have a body that's sitting in a chair, and then you have a body, if you're walking in the woods, you have a body that believes it's walking in the woods. What's interesting is that the calming effects on the illusory body transfer to the actual body. What's also interesting is that your brain believes in virtual reality, that it's in that reality. It starts to believe like it's walking, which has made many people ask, well, who's to say that this is the real world? What if your brain is tricking you into believing that you're in some three-dimensional world when in fact you're in a two-dimensional world? So the first philosophical point I'd make is the world in virtual reality may be a reminder of the illusion that we believe to be this universe. The second thing I would say is that if virtual reality causes social isolation, if it causes sort of abnormalities in perception, if it causes any kind of sort of nausea or vomiting, if it causes any kind of side effect, it should be looked at. And so losing yourself in that world, I would not recommend, but I think utilizing the world to enhance your experience in the current world is something that I would strongly recommend.
Okay. I know that we're very short on time, so I finally wanted to ask you how your colleagues have reacted to your work, because in particular, the work that you've done to try and encourage people to take more time in an unfocused manner, and which goes against, and also with the work that you do in the corporate world as well, where the attitude is of course until now to work harder and be focused. Have you received a lot of pushback against your concepts?
No, I haven't. So I think so. A lot of my colleagues have enjoyed the fact that I've highlighted this, and in corporations, people enjoy that. But I think that people struggle to figure out how to implement this in their lives, because, as you said, if you're working in a job, they're like, "Oh, this makes total sense what you're saying." And I usually share the research and I'll tell them what I'm talking about, so they see the research that is supporting what I'm saying. They just don't know how to implement it. And so usually what I will say is that this will fail unless it is a cultural change. Until your organization, like Google, says we're having napping pods so people can nap. I worked with an organization that had doodle boards. They didn't just say this out, they made it part of the culture. So I think if you make it part of your culture, it is much more likely to be successful.
That's great. Srini, thank you very much for your time today. It's been great to see you again.
Thank you, Justin.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Self-Sovereign. If you found it interesting or useful, then subscribe to the podcast and share it with others. Also, please check out the links in the description, which are related to what was discussed today. And don't forget to leave a comment and let us know what you think about this important subject.